very much, John. Could I ask the speakers to join John in front so we can have our Q&A? So we have a hybrid model of Q&A today with our in-person audience as well as our Zoom audience. Please, if you're in the Zoom, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and Holly and I will be attending to both questions from both ends.
I'll direct it to Teja here, because it's a related question here in terms of when they were working on trying to teach her the Cantonese, how exact we saw them, and of course it's very, very laborious process to do that. I think she was. Are you with us now there?
I'm still there, but
okay, we can hear you now. Okay,
okay.
Then maybe I'll switch back to Shiwa, because
yes,
I'm interested to know for the Namyang, you mentioned the interaction between the vocal decisions, the modal decisions, the interaction between the instruments and the voice. I'm interested to know in terms of what we deal with for the choirs are the very exact points of where you change vowels. For example, au. Do you sustain the ya, or do you sustain the yau? Those kinds of things. I'm sure that there's a performance practice there, but how do you have any sense of how long that takes the students of Namyang to actually learn that exactitude? Or is it not exact?
It is a very good question, and I don't think I can really answer it. But the example you raised and in your presentation, I think there's a lot of issues we are encountering, but from a very different context. So I'm glad that you raised the issue of vowels. In fact, my experience in basically Cantonese opera and Namyang, vowel is not the issue for basically Cantonese singing. But I think to them, only enunciation of vowel clearly is not enough. What is more important is the so-called consonant, or there's some characters with more than one sound or one pitches. They are very keen on listening to they call it biting the words, biting the character, meaning that they make a lot of effort to make it clear instead of make the vowels clear. Now I have another observation. In Namyang singing, if they are well-trained Western bel canto singers, they can't deal with it because their pitch is too accurate and too steady. And I think from my own presentation, one of the points I would like to make is the music or melody, particularly in Namyang, is generated from the text, from the lyrics, rather than composed or designed by composers or arrangers. So they seldom have a long note, and they really don't care what the vowel is. But before what was the consonant before the vowel is very important. So I think that's the basic difference. And I think we are dealing with performance practice or issues from a very different linguistic and cultural context. So one more point I would like to point out is I'm so glad that you raised the issue of there are so few Cantonese choral pieces. In fact, I think I would like to look at it this way. The Mandarin speaking world is more modernized or westernized in the sense that they are more comfortable with the kind of bel canto singing, choral singing starting from a church and from school institutions. And in fact, there are choral singing in Cantonese if we go to the funeral houses. And then there are a lot of, a group of Taoists or nuns chanting their singing. It's basically that kind of, if it is done in Cantonese, then it's Cantonese choral singing. And some of them are in Guanhua. So I think we are dealing with two very different aspects of working on the performance practice. I think choir, I think for John, particularly for you, it's important to have a more unified kind of practice for the different parts. And that's also part of the reason why there's so few Cantonese choral works. I think for just vocal music, Cantonese singing is all right, like in a popular song. But when you want to have part singing, a mixed chorus, then after you have dealt with the tonal tones, pitches of the original lines, then you come up with SATB. Then for the other parts, it may not match or done in a good way to make sense of it. Because if you are not singing it in the so-called Cantonese way of doing things, then it will mean something else, because the tone is so, I mean linguistic tone is so important. So I think the technique or the skill of enunciating in Cantonese singing is quite different, say, from singing in a church, singing in a big choir, and then to Cantonese opera, to Namyam.
Sure.
I would say they are very different worlds.
Yeah, if you don't mind
Yeah,
to
please.
respond to that, because one of the rich aspects of the practice as research experience we've had, because there's no authoritative standardized
Exactly.
choral
You're right.
practice in Cantonese, we've had a lot more freedom. And so the questions I've actually asked myself in this process are, should I allow myself more freedom and less exactitude? Should I just allow them to come with their own family pronunciation and mix it all together there? And so we've actually started to try to do that. It's a little difficult because they're so heavily trained in Western music
That's
that
true.
they
That's
want
true.
exactitude.
Very true.
But I do also feel it's exciting because we've got open possibilities now for establishing a new type of practice.
Yeah, you're right. I
Wonderful.
think,
Do we have any questions from the floor to add to that?
yes, maybe we talk too much. I'm
I
sorry.
can see a question forming in Ashish's hand, which is about to go up. Shall I anticipate your question, Ashish, and hand you the microphone?
Sorry?
Yeah, sure. Okay, okay. So going off screen to hand to the mic to Ashish.
No, the reason for the hesitation was because I haven't really formulated the question. It's really for Kim Ho. First of all, Kim Ho, thank you very much for this. I'd heard a little bit about your experiences with the Santur. I was just sort of wondering at what point in that journey you would locate the crux of the problem, by which I mean, is the problem in the Yangchin and its ability to assimilate the strings of the Santur? Is it in the those, you spoke about these footsteps, and I was wondering at what point how can I put it, at what point the pressure point in all this lies within that journey. I mean, what is the stress point that you want to specifically identify within this as the point where it really reveals itself? Something like that I was thinking about. Sorry, it's an inadequate question, but it might more like a provocation, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a bit hard to answer you what exactly is the stress point. You're saying the word stress point. I think you were with me together with some part of the journey, and you realize I came from playing on the Yangchin. I never know how to play the Indian Santur, and so I think only in the very late part of the South-South collaboration, and after I visited India, then I tried to use the Indian, the hard wooden mallet, the one that I'm using now, and to try to, you might say, transfer back some of the Indian experience onto my own instrument. And then I would think that actually it's not for the moment. I would think it's really the wooden mallet that really is a very important point, because all the sounds that Indian santur player can produce are very much related to the mallets, and I'm not practiced using that, and so when I start to practice on the Indian mallets, I'm sometimes surprised by what kind of sound I can make myself as well. So I think that also make me reinforce my thought, thinking that the practice is like your pair of hands are actually more important than the sound made by the strings themselves. I hope I have answered your question.
It's heavier too, right? The mallets are much
Yes.
heavier, right?
Much heavier and much more bouncing.
Can you move them as quickly as you do with the Yangqin?
No, if I have to play exactly the same virtuosic piece on the Yangqin, it's not possible. But in fact, the amount of ornaments that I can produce on a scale would be much more on the Indian.
How about I saw that you have to hold them differently as
Yes,
well,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
How long did that take you to
Uh,
adjust?
I have to say that if an Indian santur player see me doing that, they think I'm completely crazy.
You didn't give anyone a heart attack trying to teach
I,
you, did you?
I only have one lesson with a real santur player, and so I actually just find my own way to deal with the Indian santur. So that's likewise. I stressed many times when I was in India. Even I'm playing on the santur, I said I am not playing an Indian santur because I don't know how to play on an Indian santur. All I have done was just to transfer my techniques on the Yangqin onto the santur. So I do hope that I didn't violate the culture and tradition of both instruments.
I find that in the last two comments, there's this very interesting intertwining that comes out as a kind of tension between um, adhering to a certain clarity through through a tradition or through an agreed upon canonical set of rules for playing a certain instrument, and the sense of sensitivity around transgressing that, especially if you come from that tradition and that practice as Kim Ho has, and how that always needs to be balanced by the sense of we can do we can do that, we can break the rules, and this kind of improvising aspect that's necessary because there is a border crossing that's happening in the material engagement with either with addiction, with the kinds of tones and textures that are possible within a very clear bel canto framework, which many, I think, singers, myself included, just kind of come into these sorts of cultural experiments, not really knowing that our oral space is kind of irredeemably shaped by what sounds good from a bel canto perspective, and how that accounts for a very kind of useful feeling of alienation, right? When this sort of conflict happens inside practice. I mean, I would like to throw the question back at the panelists and ask, what's been the most effective way for you to productively use this discomfort when you're crossing these boundaries inside the practice? What's worked for you?
Yeah. So I think I must clarify here that I'm a sort of an amateur practitioner of Hindustani music. And my approach to it is, I mean, John is an accomplished singer, Kim Ho is an accomplished musician. I'm not a professional musician. So my engagement with the practice is probably, let's see what happens. I'm not, I think, maybe like too worried about violating the rules, because maybe I don't quite know what the rules are in the first place, or they don't maybe mean so much to me, not having spent many years in a tradition. But having said that, I totally understand where the musicians are brought together. I know where they're coming from. And especially with the Hindustani musicians, two of them in particular who are very classical North Indian training, it was really difficult for them to think of doing something other than what they have done since the time they started training when they were 2 or 3 years old. And you can see that with some people it's more difficult than with others. I think that what helped with the crossings was simply the engagement. So I remember the first time we sat in this black box with the Yangqin, and Kimo actually gave the mallets to each one of us, and we are all trying to do something, right? He could have said, you're violating the practice of the Yangqin, don't do it. But he was generous enough to say, try and see what it sounds like. So I think that we were sort of energized by that generosity that we found everywhere, and the other way around as well. If Jangi wants to compose a melody in Hindustani, no one is stopping him. Kimo has tried to play the santur, no one is stopping him. So in a sense, there was a real appreciation of the kind of crossings that were demonstrated, especially in concert. I think Kimo, you'd agree with that, right? With the Bangalore and Bombay concerts, and people are so delighted that he was playing the santur, and not with necessarily sometimes with the santur sticks. You tried the ancient mallets on the santur as well.
Yeah.
I remember, yes. So I think the context of appreciation and encouragement does go a long way in helping you to not necessarily adhere to the rules. And I think just the unfamiliarity of being in a context, and to a large extent, the Indian singers were the ones traveling to Hong Kong, traveling through China, and having to engage, even in a very daily, visceral, physical sense, they probably felt extremely alienated. And in that space, to be alienated once again by the language, by the melodies, and then to produce something using their own training, I think was a very interesting exercise for them. And you can see, and when you hear the album, you'll see what happened and what they were able to do. So I think the struggle with the vocalization of Cantonese, I don't think they changed the words, but you heard Bindu singing in Cantonese. I always ask my Cantonese speaking friends, are you, does it sound like Cantonese? And some people say, yes, it makes us understand there are many kinds of ways of speaking Cantonese, that is still intelligible. So I think that this kind of singing with Cantonese extends the boundaries of intelligibility, even for Cantonese itself. So I think that is, or in the other sense for Mandarin, which they've also sung. So I think this kind of stretching those boundaries happened. And if I may just take a minute to explain what Chow Yu Fai was doing, for the most part, the first year, he just sent us a poem that he'd written in Cantonese, a very poem he wrote 20 years ago. And then the Indian singers tried to sing it in Hindustani style. So that reached a limit of experimentation very quickly. In the second year, and you heard an example of that, the three singers sent separate melodies composed in three different Indian ragas to Yufai. And he's used to writing lyrics to, in Mandarin or in Cantonese when people send him melodies. So he treated it, it was like in the spirit of saying, okay, here's another melody, I will write a poem to it. But what was difficult, of course, was that he had to really match the tones to the notes. And the other way around as well, when Indians are trying to sing Cantonese, which are Indian languages don't have tones. So in that way, they're like many Western languages. How do you then, in a non-tonal language, keep to the tones, but also keep to your own notes at the same time? I think this was an incredible challenge. And you can see that being extremely well-trained Indian classical musicians who sing by listening and not by reading, they're able to get the Cantonese. So I think that was, for me, like a very remarkable lesson. There's some long question here, which I suspect is for me. Yes. No, yes. So this is, I'll read it aloud. My question is to Professor Ip Kim Ho, but it will go to the rest of the panelists working with this. Oops. Why is this not working? You've said that your work also speaks to the intercultural, given the interweaving lab at Friar University, etc., as per how performance studies construes it to be, bringing together unassumed performatives in post-colonial global context. Do you see this intercultural methodology in a similar impulse with the inter-Asia as methodology, or are there nuances you find further? John.
It's for you, Kim Ho, right?
No,
Yeah.
You like it?
It was
No,
for you.
you first.
Yeah.
Fry
I
University.
think if I understand your question correctly, it's mainly about whether this intercultural sort of, if there is such a methodology or theory that can be compared to the inter-Asia impulse, or yeah, or are there any nuances you find further? I must say, yeah, this is a very good question. I always ask myself, actually, even in the research center in Germany, they were asking the same question. Why are we always saying kind of Euro-Asia kind of intercultural? Why there hasn't been any research center that is on inter-Asia interculturalism. For example, this sort of Chinese and Indian dialogue on musical culture, it's very rare to be found. I must say that I am interested in this area also because Professor Teju was able to allow this kind of work to be done. And I must say, it's a very, very preliminary stage. I would really not say that I found something very substantial in this inter-Asia angle. I think there would be, if the world is really shifting from this very Euro-Asian kind of interculturalism to more this kind of inter-Asian methodology, maybe we really will find something very, very interesting. I must say, I do hope that more inter-Asia kind of research could be done in the future.
I mean, just to add to that, I also feel that the value of the talks that we saw today saw how any sort of endeavor towards inter-Asian or intercultural exchange needs to be embedded in the practices themselves, right? In the specificities and the challenges and the unique opportunities that each specific practice opens up. Of course, keeping in mind that these practices are locally rooted as well, but then in the engagement of different subjects, experimenting within the space of the practice, then maybe new opportunities can show up, right? We still have about maybe I'm aware that it's already about 5:05, but if you would like some more, 5 more minutes for questions, I think John would also like to add.
Or maybe Shu, I mean, that last question I think needs some more discussion. So
Sure.
Shuwa, do you have?
Yes, yes.
Why
I'm
would
here.
you speak to that?
Which last question? Can you remind me? Which question is it? Was it?
Yeah, that's this discussion by, if I pronounce her name correctly, Supraya. And she's asking whether this sort of inter-Asian kind of methodology that we are discussing today can be compared to the other intercultural aspect that maybe in the past has been more dominating.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah,
So
yeah.
we wonder what you think, Professor Yu.
You worded it in a very good way. In fact, this is very intriguing because in most cases, I think in the 20th century up to now, I think the relationship between the West or Asia and Europe or the West are kind of, we always, I mean, the Asians always look for how to become more and more Westernized or advanced like the West. And we kind of left behind the fact that inter-Asia, say China and India, there have been very strong cultural link, cultural exchanges in history. But somehow it's kind of discontinued. I don't know why. And particularly when we're talking about singing, for example, of course, solo singing is fine. But when we are talking about choral singing, the model or the mainstream, of course, is the canto singing and the kind of chorus we trained to be able to sight read and sing correctly or accurately. But I suppose in many Asian cultures, there are different kinds of choral singing, which we have yet to explore and to know more about this. So my experience in Namyam or Cantonese opera, because I'm a newcomer or I'm not from that two traditions. So I'm learning a new culture. So even as a Chinese, as a Cantonese, I have to relearn what have been going on in their own convention, in their own performance practice. So I think by the same token, all the music students like us, Kim Ho and I, and then Winzenburg, we are trained very, clearly from the Western model. But once we are getting to the research part, I think we have to be more accommodating and open our eyes and ears to accept different ways of listening and appreciating and also different ways of music making. That's important. So I think this is all about ethnomusicology. So be open to cultures are very different and multifaceted. So I think at this moment, the world has changed to the point that there's nothing really limited. I mean, in terms of resources and recordings and videos, it's all available on the internet. So for those who are interested to know, they are available. So I think we better broaden our horizon and to be more accommodating. That's how I feel. Is that all right? Yes.
I hope we are responding to Supraya's question. I don't know.
I hope so.
Are you a fellow at the Free University? I wonder. Oh, okay. Right. That's great.
Any other questions? Or additional comments or thoughts that you'd like to add? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for today's the speakers of a great vision. I just have one very simple question back to the topic. What is the definition of the qualities of the voice? How to define the quality of voice? Because I had a lot of good knowledges from different parts of the speakers. And I just want to have this simple question, because how to be a good voice? Yes, I think I heard a lot of the videos, and I think because in my communication with people, at that I find voice is very important. Just like music, not just music, voice itself. I just want to have some very simple answers, because I think in my communication with people, I think voice is very important. Thank you so much for your help.
Well, maybe I can join in for this question. I think
Who would like to start with that simple but challenging question?
Singers.
Yeah.
it's very challenging. But my simple response is there's no absolute standard for what is the good voice or bad voice. Of course, musically, for trained musicians, of course, we know how good or bad one sings, right? But I think voice or vocal quality is also culturally bound. I think that's very important. And it also relies on the linguistic characteristic of that particular kind of music. So there's no one single standard for a good voice. That's my very simple response. Thank you.
Well, yeah, and you think it's a simple question, but it's a very, very profound
very profound
question that gets to the heart of everything we're talking about with borders here. The key issue in my mind for voice is the fact that we can't see it. All
That's
the
true.
other instruments you can see, and so the processes of learning it are much different, whereas we go back to a primitive stage where we separate our spoken language, which itself is, of course, our defining feature of humanity, to then what constitutes music versus spoken communication there. And of course, you can, a good example is if you listen to the birds singing there, how you're starting to create imagination. So the fact that we can't see the voice is something that's closely tied to our imagination and then to our identity in relation to our spoken communication there. So that quality is something that I think is something that has been part of human development in questioning what is good and what is not. Do you do it just because you want to sing, hey, or do you want to make it sound, shaped like a jewel or like a pearl, hey, something like that. We all have different ways in relation to, as Shiwa was saying, the cultures that start to form the boundaries of our
Yes.
imagination, our imaginary sound there. And then that turns into a kind of an artistic tradition that you're constantly negotiating with, changing it, challenging it, trying to match it, trying to make it better all the time. Great question, actually.
Yes.
Very good. Yeah.
In human communication, the voice becomes very important. It's not only what you said speech, but the voice have a very different impact on what you speak. I see qualities in voice is my part of personal experience. I find this voice like today's sharing. Voice is a very important in mind and in our brain. So I think in this sharing, I see a lot of multicultural exchange, and it's very important in today's the global world that people when you speak, take care the person's they listen. The voice is very important. So thank you so much for today's the overall the running, and I see a lot of very nice talking from the speakers and the host. The voice, I have heard a lot of important message. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any final thoughts or questions before I conclude? Oh, that's a pretty good way to end our conversation today. The importance of the voice and the importance of listening. So thank you, everybody.
Thank
Let me
you.
go back
Thank
on
you.
screen again. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Professor Siwa.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Um,
you, everybody.
Sorry you won't be able to join us for dinner in
I'm
a bit.
sorry. Maybe in the future. Yeah. Enjoy your dinner. Enjoy your dinner.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here on
Thank you.
Zoom and in person. Good night. Bye.
Good night. Good night.